The
A
last
dollar
livestock auction
pony.
of the season settled over West Bridge like dust in a dry throat, scratchy, harsh, and unrelenting. The sun
The
dragged low
silver
across the
coin
sky,
falls into the
stretching long
dust.
shadows over the stock
King.
pens, where horses shifted uneasily in the stillness. At the back gate, a bay mare
Sold
stood,
to the
trembling
man
ribs
with
sharp beneath
eyes
her
as
hide flanks,
cold as
marked
money.
with dried blood too weak even to resist the crowd's restless eyes. Around her, men jostled and bargained with voices that carried no mercy, only the calculation of profit. To them, flesh, whether animal or human, was measured in coins, not compassion. Their laughter cut through the autumn air, brittle and cruel, as though lives on display were nothing more than wares in a market. It was a frontier theater of survival, stripped of sentiment, where the only rules that mattered were the price shouted and the hand that dared to claim. Man lurched forward from the rail, a bottle dangling from his hand, his grin as crooked as his words. Package deal, he slurred, jerking the rope tied to Clara's wrist. $1. You take the horse, you take the girl. His voice oozed mockery, drawing a ripple of laughter from the men around him. One spat into the dust, another barked, cheap help, that's all she is. Can't talk, can't hear, won't back talk. What more you need? Clara stood barefoot in the pen dress torn at the hem, hair clinging to her face. Yet even in her silence she refused to bow. Her hands hung quiet at her sides, her body still, but her gaze steady, unyielding, cut through the haze of ridicule. No plea, no tears, no bargain. The world wanted to define her worth in a single coin, but her eyes told a different story. She was not desperate, not broken, only waiting to be seen. Thomas had turned halfway, ready to leave the dust and the sneers behind, when his eyes met Clara's. They were not begging, not even hopeful, something sharp or steadier. It was recognition, as if in her silence she already knew him, as if she saw in him what no one else cared to notice. That look stopped him cold. The mare behind her snorted froth curling from her nose, but Thomas's gaze stayed on the girl. Around them, laughter rippled like dry weeds in the wind. $1, the drunk slurred again, thrusting the rope forward like a leash. Silver's fair cowboy. Without a word, Thomas reached into his coat. A single coin glinted between his fingers, before dropping into the drunk's open palm with a dull final ring. The crowd chuckled low and mean voices taunting, but Thomas didn't answer. He only stepped forward, loosening the knot at Clara's wrist, letting the rope fall uselessly into the dust. The drunk shoved the rope forward with a smirk, but Clara flinched instinctively, her shoulders tightening. Before the man could jeer again, Thomas stepped closer, his hand steady. With a firm tug, he loosened the knot himself, letting the rope slide free and drop into the dirt. The sound was soft, yet it carried more weight than the jeers circling them. He didn't drag her, didn't clutch the rope as proof of purchase. Instead, he gathered the mare's lead gently, then turned toward the wagon. Clara hesitated only a breath before following, not behind him like chattel, but beside him, her steps quiet and level. The crowd muttered mocking under their breath, but Thomas gave no answer. His silence was not weakness, it was refusal. Each step he took said plainly what no words needed. This was not ownership. It was the return of something that should never have been taken, her dignity. The last of the laughter died behind them as Thomas led the mare through the crowd, Clara moving silently at his side. No rope bound her now, only the weight of curious stares. When they reached the wagon, she didn't wait for permission. With the quiet grace of someone used to vanishing into corners, she climbed up and curled into the wooden bed, drawing a worn blanket over her shoulders. Thomas took the driver's bench, gathering the reins with his usual economy of movement. He was about to set the horse forward when he felt it a touch light as breath against his sleeve. He glanced back. Clara's fingers had brushed the coarse fabric, barely lingering yet enough to mean something no words could carry. Her eyes didn't lift to meet his. They turned instead toward the hills beyond the town, the direction of all things unknown. But that fleeting touch was unmistakable, gratitude, trust, or simply recognition of the man who had untied her. Thomas said nothing. He only flicked the reins and the wagon groaned into motion. Wheels creaked, dust rose, and the town shrank behind them with every turn of the spokes. Neither of them looked back. The setting sun stretched the road ahead in a ribbon of solemn gold, pulling them forward into whatever waited beyond the ridge. In that silence, something shifted, less a promise, more a beginning, born from a touch no one else saw. By the time the wagon rattled to a halt, the last light of the day had folded into darkness. Before them stood Thomas's cabin, squared timbers, rising against the night, its low roof framed by a thin line of smoke curling from the chimney. It wasn't much plain and weathered by years of wind, but it stood firm, a place that held. Thomas stepped down first, boots pressing into the hard earth. For a moment, Clara didn't move. Then, without prompting, she gathered the worn blanket around her shoulders and followed her bare feet, meeting the cold porch planks without a flinch. The door creaked as Thomas pushed it open, and at once the glow of a lamp spread across the room, chasing shadows into the corners. Inside, the space was modest, yet steady. An iron stove hummed with a low fire, its warmth rising into the beams. An oak table stood square at the center, scarred by years of meals and work, beside a few simple cabinets lining the wall. There was no ornament, no finery, only the quiet pulse of a life lived plainly. Clara lingered by the wall, taking it in. She wasn't asked to sit nor told where to stand. Still, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was not in the open, not watched or judged, only sheltered. The cabin spoke without words. Here was a place where the air itself did not demand, only allowed. Thomas set a tin cup on the oak table, the firelight catching the steam as it rose. Clara stepped forward, lifted it with both hands, and drank slowly. Not a word passed between them. When she set it down, Thomas crossed to the stove, opened a drawer, and drew out a stub of chalk. He tapped it gently against the wooden doorframe. "Name," he said, soft, steady. Not a demand, not an order, but an invitation. Clara froze, uncertain, then moved with quiet resolve. Kneeling at the frame, she pressed the chalk to the wood. Each stroke was deliberate, steady, despite her trembling fingers. C-L-A-R-A. Thomas read it once, then again aloud, letting it settle into the room like a promise. She did not smile, but the faintest nod lifted her chin. For the first time in years, she had been called by her own name, not by what others claimed she was. Thomas lingered by the doorframe, his gaze fixed on the 5 letters chalked there. Clara. The name seemed to breathe in the glow of the fire, no longer just marks of chalk, but the shape of something beginning. The cabin was silent when he realized she was no longer inside. Stepping into the yard, he saw the barn door left ajar, a faint light seeping through the slats. He crossed the soft ground, boots sinking into thaw, and paused at the entrance. Inside the bay, mare stood trembling, head-low, flanks scarred from past abuse. Clara was beside her, barefoot on the straw, a damp cloth moving gently along the animal's side. She worked without hesitation, her touch calm, steady, almost reverent. Thomas folded his arms, watching. Many men had been thrown for less, yet the mare stood still, breathing into the quiet as if she already knew Clara. And Thomas, for the first time, believed beginnings could be this quiet. Dust swirled in the thin shafts of light that pierced the barn's slats, carrying the faint scent of old straw and smoke. The bay mare trembled in her stall, ribs sharp, flanks streaked with old scars. Yet she did not shy or kick when Clara knelt beside her. Bare feet pressed into the hay, she worked with the patience of someone who had learned to steady pain with her own hands. A strip of cloth, already stained, was in one palm, a fresh, damp rag in the other. She moved slowly, drawing the wet fabric down the length of the mare's scarred side in long, even strokes. Her fingers did not press or prod. They listened. Each pass was like a question asked and somehow answered in silence. The mare's breathing deepened, shudder softened, and her eyes closed for a moment, not from exhaustion, but from release. At the doorway, Thomas stood with arms folded, saying nothing. He had seen men try brute force commands, bark sharp, only to be flung against wood or stone. But this was different. Clara was not taming the animal. She was listening to it. No words, no reins, just quiet rhythm, as if her hands carried a language the rest of the world had forgotten. Watching her, Thomas felt something shift. Here was proof that silence could be more powerful than speech, that healing came not from ownership, but from recognition. For the first time, he understood Clara didn't just tend wounds, she heard them. The afternoon sky shifted without warning, copper light sliding across the ridge like a shiver. Thomas was bent over the calf pen, hand on a young steer's leg, when the barn door burst open behind him. Clara ran barefoot through the dust hair, tangled by the wind, her breath sharp but wordless. She didn't shout, she didn't need to. Fingers closed around his sleeve with a force that startled him, tugging him away from the oak that loomed just past the shed. He dropped the bucket, startled by her urgency. "What is it?" he asked, but Clara only trembled, eyes fixed on the ridge, as though she could see something no one else could. Then the world cracked apart. A white bolt struck the oak with such violence it tore the air itself. The sound ripped through Thomas's chest, stealing his breath, and fire raced down the tree's spine in an instant. Splinters flew, sparks showering into dry grass. Behind them, the mare screamed against her stall wall, hooves rattling the boards. The oak, once whole, now stood split and burning smoke curling black against the unsettled sky. Thomas turned stunned, realizing Clara had pulled him clear only seconds before the strike. She stood in the dirt barefoot, her face illuminated by the flames, but she didn't flinch. She hadn't guessed. She had known. Her stillness in that moment, her gaze fixed not on the fire, but on him, said more than words could. The storm rolled away as suddenly as it had come, leaving the smell of scorched bark and singed air behind. Together they doused the sparks, stamping embers, until the grass lay blackened but safe. That night in the quiet cabin, Thomas's eyes kept drifting to Clara across the table. He remembered the exact weight of her hand pulling him, the silent insistence that had saved his life. She hadn't spoken a single word. Yet in that moment she had said everything, that danger could be felt before it struck, that trust could be built on instinct, and that sometimes belief begins not with proof, but with survival. That night, after the smoke had cleared, and the fire was nothing but a dull glow in the hearth, Thomas sat at the small oak table with the silver dollar in his palm. He turned it over between his fingers, the coin glinting faintly in the lamplight, and for the first time it looked small, almost insulting. His voice was low, as if speaking more to himself than to her. "That's what they said you were worth," he murmured. $1. Across from him, Clara sat wrapped in her shawl, shoulders squared though her silence carried 1,000 weights. She didn't look at the coin. Instead, her eyes settled on Thomas. Slowly, deliberately, she reached across the space, not for the silver, not for proof, but for him. Her fingers brushed the sleeve of his coat, light as breath, a touch that said, "I am here." That is enough. No demands followed, no questions, only that quiet connection. Thomas exhaled, setting the coin down gently beside her tin cup. For years he had eaten at that table alone, the fire, his only companion, silence, his only company. But with that small gesture, the room felt changed. The table no longer belonged to solitude. It carried 2 cups, now 2 steady heartbeats, and the unspoken recognition that value was never measured in silver. The dollar lay forgotten between them. What mattered was the space it bridged, the proof that loneliness, like fire, could be doused when someone chose to stay. The pasture stretched quiet beneath a thin veil of frost. At its edge stood a crooked oak, roots wrapped tight around a lone gravestone, Grange, 1819, 1870. Thomas stood over it, hat in hand, his jaw locked. The land around him, every fence post, every acre, had been his father's claim taken in someone else's storm. "I never earned this place," he said at last, voice rough. "My father gave me the land and the blood that came with it. I never buried the guilt, just carried it." Behind him, Clara's steps softened the silence. She didn't speak. Instead, she reached forward and set his own hand flat against his chest, steady and firm, not to console, but to remind him where the true weight lived. Then, moving past, she knelt by the stone, brushing away the curled leaves and dirt with deliberate care, her fingertips lingering as if rewriting what history refused to carve. In that small act, she marked the beginning of release. That night, Thomas drifted into a dream, thick with smoke and fire. Not the sudden strike of lightning he had seen days before, but the roar of cannon fire, the churn of dirt beneath boots, the cries swallowed by smoke. His father's voice came through the haze, rough and commanding. "I gave you the land, son, and I gave you the blood on it." He woke with a start, sweat dampening his neck despite the cold. The cabin was silent except for the low glow of the hearth. In the rocking chair nearby, Clara sat wrapped in her shawl, watching the flame as if it carried words of its own. On the table beside her lay something small and blue. Thomas's breath caught. The handkerchief, his mother's, worn soft from years, trimmed with crooked stitches made by a hand long gone. He hadn't seen it in over a decade, not since locking it away in the oak chest beneath the bed, a place he had thought no one would ever reach. "Clara," he whispered, his voice uneven. She did not look at him. She didn't need to. Instead, she rose quietly, took one slow step toward the door, and left him in the hush of the room. Thomas sat unmoving, staring at the cloth. No explanation had been offered, none was needed. Some things weren't searched for, he realized they were simply understood. Clara hadn't asked permission to bring out what he had buried. She hadn't demanded answers or pressed at his guilt. She had simply placed a piece of his mother's love where he could not avoid it, a silent reminder that even in a legacy marked by war and blood, tenderness had once existed. The fire snapped and Thomas reached for the handkerchief with careful fingers. Its fabric was frayed, its edges uneven, yet it felt whole in his palm. For the first time in years, the weight on his chest shifted, not gone but shared. Clara's quiet act told him what words could not, that she saw the wound, and without asking chose to sit beside it. And that, he realized, was how healing began. It began quietly, like smoke curling under a door. At first it was a remark from Martha Weaver on her porch. She watches the cattle too close, like she already knows which one will fall. Soon the preacher's boy fanned the flames, telling anyone who would listen, "She touched our goat 2 days later, the kid came too early." That ain't natural. Fear has a way of spreading faster than truth. By the week's end, whispers followed Clara wherever she walked. At the general store, a mother tugged her daughter sharply aside as Clara passed, though she carried nothing more sinister than a sack of flour. At the post office, a man spat near her boots, his eyes narrowing as though the dust on the ground had been her fault. Clara did not argue. She did not shout. But Thomas noticed how she folded into herself when those stares lingered too long, her shoulders curving, her steps smaller, her hands tightening around the basket she carried. Silence, once her shield, had begun to feel like chains. In the privacy of the cabin, she busied herself with chores, mending, stirring, tending the fire, but the glow in her eyes had dimmed. Where once her stillness had been chosen, now it was imposed, pressed upon her, by a town that decided she was strange, dangerous other. Thomas saw it all, the slow shrinking of a woman who had never begged, who had never asked for pity. And in his chest rose the uneasy certainty that silence alone would not protect her this time. Fever hit hard and fast. The ranch hand's boy lay restless in the barn, breath shallow, skin burning with heat that made his mother weep. The doctor was gone east for a wedding, no one else came forward. But Clara did. She moved with quiet certainty, kneeling beside the boy's cot. One hand rested on his chest, the other on his brow. She didn't pray, didn't speak, she listened. Then she rose, slipped into the yard, and clipped herbs from the drying rack, lavender, feverfew, rabbit tobacco. She crushed them down, brewed the leaves into a bitter draught, and cooled it to warmth. Holding the cup to his lips, she guided each slow swallow. Through the night she sat nearby, her stillness steadier than any medicine. By dawn the boy stirred. His eyes blinked open, weak but searching. Hunger returned to him like a small, blessed sign of life. His mother sobbed in relief, clutching Clara's hands and whispering thanks. But gratitude in the dark of night does not always survive the daylight. By morning, questions hissed at the well. How did she know what to use, whispered one. No one even told her what was wrong. Another muttered, "That ain't natural." Fear crept back, low and stubborn as fog, and the same voices that had called her a savior began to twist into something else. Thomas saw it clearly, the way suspicion rose the moment healing did not carry an explanation. Clara had offered life, but the town chose unease. The crunch of boots on gravel came before the knock. 8 of them, men and women alike, stood at the edge of Thomas's yard, each gripping an unlit torch like a verdict waiting to be passed. Their faces were stiff with certainty, not rage, a colder thing. Mr. Withers stepped forward, his coat too fine for a man of soil. "We want her gone," he said flatly. "She sees too much. Hears what shouldn't be heard. Talks to animals like they answer back. My steer dropped dead the week she touched it. That's curse enough for me." Whispers rippled through the group, fear made louder by numbers. Behind the curtain, Clara had already seen them, already felt the weight of their judgment. She moved toward the door, but Thomas lifted his hand, stopping her. Then he descended the porch steps, his frame filling the space between her and the crowd. "I paid $1, he began, voice low but firm. That's what she was worth to the man who tied her like livestock. A single coin." He let the words hang, then pressed on. "But since then she has listened to me more than anyone ever has. Not with ears. With her hands, her breath, her heart." Somewhere in the group a mutter flickered, doubt, or perhaps shame. Thomas squared his shoulders. "Run her off if you want," he said evenly. "But you'll have to go through me first." The torches wavered not from flame, but from grip. One by one, fingers loosened. Dust rose as boots turned away. The crowd, so bold a moment ago, drifted back into the dark without striking a match. Inside, the fire popped softly. Clara placed a pot of cider on the stove, then sat beside Thomas at the table. She didn't reach for chalk, didn't sign a word. She simply laid her hand over his, steady and silent. It was not thanks, not apology. It was truth unspoken and undeniable. Snow came quietly that year, not in storms, but in a slow sift that blanketed the ranch in silence. The world outside seemed muffled, yet inside the cabin something had shifted. Since the night when neighbors left with their torches unlit, the air held a different weight, calmer, steadier, as if the walls themselves breathed easier. Each morning began with familiar rhythm. Clara rose before dawn, brewed coffee in the tin pot, and set it by the stove's glow. She brushed the horses in slow circles, her touch as sure as the light spreading over frost-pale fields. Thomas tended the fences, repaired tack, and stacked wood, while she moved through the cabin with quiet purpose, the cadence of their steps falling into unspoken harmony. In the evenings, when the wind rattled against the shutters, Thomas would return to find Clara seated near the hearth with scraps of cloth in her lap. Wool-worn soft leather cuffs, salvaged from an old coat, bits of flannel saved from his past winters. She stitched without a pattern, each thread measured with deliberate care. She wasn't making something for herself. Every mended seam, every hidden knot was for him. Thomas stood once at the barn door, watching her fingers move. There was reverence in her work, as though each stitch carried a sentence in a language only her heart knew. The garment she shaped was more than cloth. It was testimony, a declaration that she belonged here, and that she chose to keep him clothed against the cold. The snow deepened outside, but indoors warmth grew in a different way, sewn line by sewn line, a life shared. The late afternoon bled into dusk as Thomas worked the fence line. A stone shifted beneath his horse's hoof, and in one brutal instant the world slammed sideways. He hit the frozen ground, shoulder-first, pain tearing through his ribs like fire. Breathless blood seeping down his sleeve, he forced himself upright. Each step toward the cabin rattled his frame, the weight of every movement nearly buckling his knees. By the time he reached the porch, night had swallowed the ranch. The door burst open before he could lift his hand. Clara was already there, her shawl flying behind her eyes steady. She slipped under his arm, guiding him inside with the strength of someone who had carried burdens heavier than fear. In the fire's glow, she peeled away his coat, unwound the rough cloth he'd tied hastily, and revealed the raw scrape. Her hands were sure warm water, clean cloth herbs crushed into a poultice of pine and yarrow. She pressed it gently against his ribs, her brow furrowed, but she spoke no words. None were needed. Thomas watched her breath shallow. "You always know," he whispered, voice ragged. Clara met his gaze, and for a long heartbeat, nothing moved but the firelight flickering across her face. Then, without hesitation, she took his hand in both of hers, raised it to her cheek, and bent closer. Her lips brushed the edge of his wound, not to heal it with magic, but to understand it. It was not a kiss of passion, but of recognition, one broken soul telling another, "I see you, and I will not turn away." The fire had burned low, filling the cabin, with the kind of hush that magnifies every breath. Outside, snow swept against the eaves in restless currents, yet inside, time slowed to the rhythm of the flames. Thomas sat at the rough-hewn table shoulders, tense ribs still aching beneath the poultice Clara had pressed into place. He had never been a man of many words, spoken ones least of all. Tonight, silence pressed heavier than pain. At last he reached for a scrap of paper, his calloused hand moving awkwardly, but with intent. The pencil scratched steady across the page, each letter deliberate, squared, like fence posts sunk deep in frozen earth. When he finished, he slid the slip across the table toward her. Clara's fingers hovered, then pressed lightly against the ink. Her eyes traced the line once, then again. "I want to hear your heart, if you'll let me listen with mine." For a moment she didn't move. The only sound was the pop of a log collapsing into embers. Then her gaze lifted, luminous in the lamplight, not startled, not hesitant, but filled with a depth that made Thomas forget the sting of his wound. She didn't take the paper. Instead, she reached across, covering his rough hand with her own, small and steady. Slowly, Clara leaned closer. Her forehead brushed his, her breath mingling with his own. And then her lips touched his unhurried, certain a kiss without performance. It was not meant to claim or to dazzle, but to promise. In that quiet exchange, every unspoken vow found its voice. The storm outside clawed at the shutters, but within those walls the warmth deepened stronger than firewood could provide. They remained close foreheads, touching eyes closed, as if listening to a rhythm older than words, the pulse of two hearts, steady now, finally in tune. Panic spread through West Bridge like wildfire. A boy no more than 7 had vanished during the morning chores. His mother found only a single boot at the edge of the woods, half buried in snow and nothing else. No tracks, no voice answering the frantic shouts. Men with rifles and dogs fanned out into the trees, their torches bobbing like restless stars. But the snow swallowed every clue, leaving nothing but silence. At the ranch, Thomas had just thrown the saddle on the mare when 2 riders thundered into the yard. The Simmons boy, one gasped. Gone into the woods, winds too high for tracks. Thomas pulled on his coat, ready to ride, but Clara was already stepping into the yard. She did not speak. She did not ask questions. Instead, she sank to her knees in the snow, pressed her palms flat against the frozen earth, then lowered her cheek until it touched the ground, as though listening for a pulse hidden beneath the frost. The others exchanged wary glances, but when Clara rose, she did not hesitate. She pointed west, her arm, steady, her face certain. Without a word, Thomas trusted her. He spurred the mare forward, the search party trailing behind. They rode through gullies and across dry creek beds, the wind cutting sharp, the trail invisible. Yet Clara's direction never wavered. It was as if the land itself whispered to her, its broken branches and bent grasses, forming a language no one else could read. Nearly an hour later, in a hollow sheltered by twisted oaks, they found him curled against the trunk, cold, frightened but alive. His ankle was twisted, but his breath came strong when Clara laid her hand against his chest. She exhaled, then long and quiet, as though releasing a burden she had carried since the moment she knelt in the snow. Back in town, whispers shifted. No longer cursed, no longer strange. Clara was named differently now. They said with awe, more than suspicion, she hears with her heart. Spring crept slowly into the valley, the thaw loosening streams and softening the pasture. With it came something new, quiet footsteps at Thomas's cabin door. At first a boy with a bruised wrist, his mother too ashamed to ask for help out loud. Clara welcomed him in, wrapped the wrist with a strip of linen, and gave the boy a simple charm of dried lavender. She asked for nothing. She never did. Soon others followed. A widow with a cough that lingered past the winter frost. A farmhand with a stubborn fever. A young girl who could not sleep for the nightmares that plagued her. They came hesitantly, never announcing themselves with grand words or formal requests. They only knocked softly or stood waiting in the yard until Clara opened the door. And she would listen, not with questions, but with her hands, her quiet eyes, her way of leaning close until the truth revealed itself. She brewed teas, pressed herbs, and sometimes only sat with them long enough for their fear to soften. What she gave was rarely dramatic, no miracles, no spectacle, but always carried the weight of being understood. In return, townsfolk left tokens on the cabin steps, a jar of honey still warm from the comb, a hand-stitched wool scarf, a basket of dried apples. They did not thank her with words, perhaps because words felt too fragile for what she offered. Instead, they gave what their hands could make, and their silence carried the respect they had once withheld. The whispers that once branded Clara as cursed were fading. In their place grew something steadier, quieter trust. Evening had laid a soft lilac veil over the hills, and Thomas and Clara sat together on the bench beneath the old oak he had built with his own hands. It was a place where they had ended many days, shoulder to shoulder, watching the pasture sink into dusk. Thomas turned toward her, a cup of tea cooling between his palms. His voice was rough, uncertain. "I was wrong," he said. "That day in town I called you the best deal I ever made. But you weren't a deal at all. You were a gift. I just didn't see it soon enough." The breeze tugged gently at Clara's braid. For a long moment she only looked at him, her dark eyes steady. Then, as if dust had lifted from a long-closed surface, her lips parted. The sound was soft, tremulous, yet certain. "I never needed sound. Only you." Thomas blinked, stunned. All this time he had known her silence, honored it, built a life around gestures and touch. To hear her voice, 6 simple words, was like hearing a truth spoken by the earth itself. He reached for her hand, clasping it firmly, his eyes shining with something rawer than gratitude. "I've been listening," he said quietly, "long before I knew how. Clara leaned in her forehead, resting against his, her voice lingering in the air like a fragile flame that had finally been given breath. Under the oak tree in that quiet twilight, they spoke no more, for nothing else was needed. Time at the ranch was never measured by clocks or calendars. There were no anniversaries marked on paper, no celebrations lit with candles or banners. Instead, Thomas and Clara learned to measure their years in smaller rhythms, the way morning tea cooled. Before the first sip, the steady breath of horses at dawn, the warmth of two hands finding each other without searching. Seasons passed not with ceremony, but with the simple fact that their footsteps slowed together and their hair silvered in unison. Life unfolded in quiet repetitions that became sacred. The chickens nested closer to the porch, the oak tree sagged lower with each spring, and Clara's presence filled every corner of the cabin, not with noise, but with meaning. Children began to arrive, not summoned, but drawn: boys from West Bridge, girls from farther out, all restless, all searching. They came because they had heard whispers of a woman who listened deeper than ears could reach. Clara never raised her voice to teach. Instead, she knelt beside them in the pasture, showing how to wait still enough for a rabbit to stay in its burrow. She guided small hands to rest against the flank of a skittish horse, teaching that calm travels from palm to muscle like water through earth. She tilted their faces to the horizon, teaching them to read the shift of wind across a fence line as a story of what was coming long before it arrived. The children learned not just how to see, but how to perceive, not just how to hear, but how to listen with something greater than ears. And when one of them finally understood, pausing steady, patient enough for the world to answer on its own, Clara's lips would curve into that quiet, private smile, as if dawn itself had touched frost and made it melt. For Thomas, this was the measure of time, not birthdays or years, but the countless moments when Clara's gift turned silence into wisdom, when their shared life became proof that love endures, not through grand declarations, but through the quiet practice of listening day after day. When the next storm came, panic spread quickly through West Bridge. A young boy had gone missing in the snow, his tracks swallowed by wind before anyone could follow. But this time no one argued. No one wasted words. They rode straight to Thomas's ranch. Clara stepped out before they even asked. She did not hesitate, did not waver. Kneeling in the snow, she pressed her palms flat against the frozen ground, then lowered her cheek as though listening to the earth itself. A breath, a pause, and then she stood, arm lifted, finger pointing west. No questions were raised. The search party, hardened men and worried mothers alike, fell into line behind her. Hooves and boots broke the silence, but no voice interrupted. It was no longer curiosity or doubt. It was instinct. When Clara pointed, they followed. Faith in her had become something deeper than belief. It had become reflex. Through frozen brush and brittle silence, Clara led them west, her stride, sure as if the land itself had spoken. After nearly 3 miles, the group reached a hollow where an old oak had fallen. Beneath its sheltering trunk lay the missing boy, cold, frightened, but alive. Relief broke over the search party like a tide, but no one cheered. No one filled the air with empty words. Instead, there was a hush, heavy and reverent, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile miracle. Mothers wept softly. Fathers pulled their hats low. Clara knelt, her hands steady as she checked the boy's pulse, then lifted her gaze just long enough to meet Thomas's eyes. That glance alone told the truth. Trust was no longer debated, no longer earned. It was complete. From that night forward, silence itself became the only applause she ever needed. At the crest of the hill, the day bled into gold, the horizon brushed with the quiet fire of autumn. Thomas and Clara stood side by side, the mare grazing nearby, her foal nudging at the tall grass. Clara turned, laughter trembling through her shoulders, soft and unguarded. It wasn't loud, but it carried farther than any sound could. Thomas smiled, wonder flickering in his eyes, like a man who still couldn't believe his fortune. He leaned close, pressing the gentlest kiss to her lips. Not the first kiss, not the last, simply another note in a song they kept writing without end. The wind stirred the grass as if remembering, carrying their silence like a hymn. There was no need for grand declarations, no tale to conclude. Their story did not finish at sunset. It lived on each day in the language of touch, presence, and chosen belonging.